There's a strange and tragic pantheon in the history of music. It's a club, they call it, and the price of admission is impossibly high. The 27 Club is a collection of ghosts, brilliant talents like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison, all extinguished at the same young age. Their stories are told and retold, their faces etched into the Mount Rushmore of rock and roll tragedy. But what if I told you there's another member of that club? A man whose voice became the anthem of a generation, whose music defined the spirit of Woodstock, but whose face and name have been almost completely lost to the fog of history. He was a frontman, but he never looked the part. He was a scholar, a conservationist, and a musical genius who seemed almost allergic to the fame he achieved. He was a man who sang about going up the country, away from the city, seeking a simpler, freer life, while privately he was trapped in a darkness so profound he couldn't find his way out. He died alone just weeks before Hendrix and Joplin, in the quiet woods on a hill behind his bandmate's house. This is the story of the forgotten phantom of the 27 Club, Alan Blind Owl Wilson, the gentle, troubled soul of Canned Heat. To understand Alan Wilson, you have to understand the world he was born into and the one he helped create. The early 1960s in America were a pressure cooker. The post-war optimism of the 50s was giving way to a deep cultural fissure. Young people were questioning everything: the government, the war in Vietnam, consumerism, the very fabric of society their parents had built. And in this cauldron of discontent, they went searching for something more authentic, something real. They found it in the past. A powerful new current began to flow through the youth culture, a deep and passionate blues revival. This wasn't just about music. It was a pilgrimage. Young, mostly white kids from the suburbs were digging through dusty record bins, listening to crackling 78s, and seeking out the aging, often forgotten black musicians from the Mississippi Delta who had laid the groundwork for all of American popular music decades before. People like Son House, Skip James, and John Lee Hooker were suddenly being rediscovered, treated not as relics, but as prophets of a raw, honest truth. This was the world that shaped Alan Wilson. Born in Arlington, Massachusetts in 1943, he was a world away from the juke joints of the Delta, but his soul was right there. He wasn't a casual fan. He was a devout disciple, a scholar of the blues. While other kids were listening to pop radio, Alan was hunched over a record player, trying to decipher the complex guitar tunings and haunting vocal phrasings of men who had lived lives he could only imagine. He was different from the start, exceptionally bright, but also exceptionally awkward. He was severely nearsighted, and his thick glasses earned him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, the Owl. Socially, he was withdrawn, more comfortable with his books and records than with people. He enrolled in Boston University, majoring in music, but his real education was happening outside the classroom. He was immersing himself in the Boston folk and blues scene, becoming a quiet authority on this music that so few people his age truly understood. One of his most significant early achievements, and one that speaks volumes about his character, had nothing to do with fame. The legendary Delta bluesman Son House had been rediscovered in 1964 after decades of obscurity. He was older, his hands were shaky, and he could no longer remember how to play many of his own iconic songs. It was the young, unassuming Alan Wilson who sat with the master, patiently listening to his old recordings and reteaching him his own music. Think about that for a moment. A 21-year-old kid from a Boston suburb with the knowledge and dedication to essentially restore the musical memory of a living legend. This wasn't about glory. It was about preservation. It was about love for the art form. This quiet, almost academic passion was the bedrock of everything Alan Wilson would become. But there was a darkness in him, too. Even in these early years, friends noticed a deep-seated melancholy. He struggled with anxiety and depression, feelings that were profoundly misunderstood in an era before mental health was openly discussed. He once tried to take his own life by driving his car off a highway in Boston, an act that led to a period of institutionalization where he was subjected to electroshock therapy, a brutal and often ineffective treatment at the time. He emerged from it even more withdrawn, more convinced that he was fundamentally broken, that he didn't fit into the world. He felt like an outsider looking in, a feeling that would only intensify as fame unexpectedly came knocking. The story of Canned Heat begins with another blues-obsessive Bob the Bear, Haight. Haight was the polar opposite of Wilson. He was a mountain of a man, gregarious, loud, with an encyclopedic knowledge of blues records and a booming voice to match. He and Alan met through a mutual friend, and despite their contrasting personalities, they were bonded by their shared devotion to the blues. They decided to form a band, one that wouldn't just imitate the blues, but would live it, breathe it, and translate its raw power for a new generation. They named the band Canned Heat after a 1928 song by Tommy Johnson about a desperate alcoholic drinking sterno, a brand of cooking fuel. It was a dark, gritty name, a nod to the hardship and authenticity of the music they loved. With Bob as the boisterous frontman and collector, and Alan as the quiet musical architect and instrumental virtuoso, they had their foundation. They recruited guitarist Henry the Sunflower Vestine, another fiery and brilliant player, along with bassist Larry the Mole Taylor and drummer Frank Cook, who would later be replaced by the steady, powerful Fito de la Parra. The band moved to Los Angeles, the epicenter of the burgeoning psychedelic rock scene. They were an odd fit. They weren't writing dreamy songs about peace and love in the same way as their contemporaries. They were a jug band on acid, a raw, stomping, electrified reincarnation of the Delta blues. And at the heart of their unique sound was Alan Wilson. He was their secret weapon. His slide guitar playing was hypnotic, his harmonica work was otherworldly. And then there was his voice. It was one of the most peculiar and unforgettable instruments in rock history. A high, haunting, ethereal falsetto. It sounded less like a man singing and more like a spirit whispering from another time. It was the sound of pure, yearning melancholy. Their big break came in 1967 at the legendary Monterey Pop Festival. This was the event that made stars of Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. Canned Heat took the stage and delivered a performance that was raw, energetic, and utterly authentic. They weren't as flashy as The Who or as sexually charged as The Doors, but they connected with an audience that was hungry for something real. They got a record deal, and their career was officially launched. Their first major hit was a song that perfectly encapsulated Alan Wilson's strange genius. On the Road Again, released in 1968, was a radical reimagining of a 1950s blues song by Floyd Jones. But in Alan's hands, it became something else entirely. The song is built on a single hypnotic chord, a droning psychedelic pulse that feels both ancient and futuristic. Over this, Alan's harmonica wails like a lonely train, whistle in the night, and his strange floating voice sings of perpetual motion, of escape, of never staying in one place. It was a massive hit. It sounded like nothing else on the radio. It was the sound of the counterculture's wanderlust, a theme song for anyone who felt the need to just get up and go. But even as On the Road Again climbed the charts, Alan was retreating further into himself. He was now a rock star, a role he was temperamentally and psychologically incapable of playing. He hated the interviews, the photo shoots, the glad handing. He was intensely shy and suffered from crippling stage fright. Bandmate Fito de la Parra wrote in his biography that before shows, Alan would often be a nervous wreck, sometimes needing to be coaxed or even physically pushed onto the stage. Once he was up there, with an instrument in his hands, he could channel his anxieties into the music. But the moment the music stopped, the terror returned. He was the blind owl in more ways than one. His eyesight was so poor that he often had to be led onto the stage by his bandmates. Without his glasses, the world was a blur, which perhaps only added to his sense of dislocation. He was an observer, perpetually separated from the world around him by a thick lens of glass and a deep well of anxiety. While other rock stars were indulging in the excesses of fame, Alan was more likely to be found in his hotel room, reading a book on botany or writing letters to protest the cutting down of redwood forests. He was a passionate conservationist long before it was fashionable, a gentle soul who felt the pain of the natural world as acutely as he felt his own. In 1969, Canned Heat was booked to play the most iconic music festival of all time, Woodstock. As the band prepared for their performance, Alan disappeared. He wandered off from the backstage area and into the woods, seeking solace among the trees. The festival was running hours behind schedule, and as their slot approached, the band grew frantic. They couldn't find their lead singer and musical linchpin. Finally, their manager found him sitting peacefully on a tree stump, just enjoying the quiet of nature, seemingly oblivious to the 400,000 people waiting for him. When they finally took the stage at sunset on the second day of the festival, they delivered one of Woodstock's most definitive performances, and it was Alan's song that would become the festival's unofficial anthem. Going Up the Country was, on the surface, a simple, joyous tune. With its cheerful flute-like melody, actually played by Alan on a fife, and upbeat rhythm, it was an invitation to leave the sinking city and head for a place with fresh air and open space. The song was pure, distilled hippie idealism. It was the sound of escape, of freedom, of the utopian dream that Woodstock represented. As the sun went down over Yasgur's farm and Alan's high, otherworldly voice floated out over that sea of humanity, it became a moment of collective bliss. The song was featured prominently in the Woodstock documentary, and for millions of people around the world, Going Up the Country was the sound of Woodstock. It's one of music's cruelest ironies. The man who wrote and sang the ultimate anthem of escape and communal joy was, himself, trapped and desperately alone. The success of Woodstock only amplified the pressures he couldn't handle. The fame he had never sought became a prison. He saw the hypocrisy in the counterculture movement, the commercialization of the ideals he held so dear. He felt like a fraud, singing about a happiness and freedom that he could not find for himself. His depression deepened alarmingly. He became more reclusive, more isolated from the band. He talked openly about suicide, not in a dramatic way, but with a kind of calm academic resignation, as if it were a logical solution to an unsolvable problem. According to Fito de la Parra, Alan's conversations were often filled with a quiet despair. He felt he didn't belong on the planet, that he was too sensitive for the brutalities of life. He would lament the destruction of the environment with the same pained voice he used to discuss his own inner turmoil. His bandmates did what they could. They were a notoriously hard-living, hard-partying group, and their way of dealing with problems was often just to plow through them. They were a family, albeit a dysfunctional one, but they were ill-equipped to handle the depth of Alan's psychological pain. They tried to keep an eye on him, tried to include him, but he was drifting away, lost in a fog only he could see. In the summer of 1970, the darkness began to close in for good. He made another more serious attempt on his life, trying to drive his van off a freeway in Los Angeles. He survived, but with a crushed hand and a broken spirit. The band had to cancel a European tour. Alan was sent to a psychiatric hospital again, and again he felt the treatments did more harm than good. He checked himself out against medical advice, more convinced than ever that no one could help him. The end came on a warm Thursday in early September of 1970. Canned Heat was supposed to be flying to Berlin for the start of a new tour. Alan was staying at Bob Height's house in Topanga Canyon, a rustic wooded community in the hills above Los Angeles. It was the kind of place Alan should have loved, a home up in the country, away from the city. He didn't show up at the airport. This wasn't entirely unusual. Alan was notoriously unreliable. The band, frustrated but not yet panicked, flew to Germany without him, assuming he would catch a later flight. But when they landed, there was still no word. Back in Topanga Canyon, a few of the band's friends went to look for him. They searched the house and the grounds, and then one of them noticed his sleeping bag laid out on the steep wooded hillside behind Bob's house. Alan was inside. He was just 27 years old. The official cause of death was ruled an accidental acute barbiturate intoxication. He had sleeping pills in his system, a common way for musicians to cope with the brutal schedules of touring. The accidental ruling allowed his family to collect on his life insurance policy, but no one who knew him truly believed it was an accident. This is the central heartbreaking debate of Alan Wilson's story. Was it a tragic miscalculation, or the final deliberate act of a man who'd been trying to leave for a very long time? The evidence for suicide is compelling. His history of depression, his previous attempts, his open discussions about ending his life. Fito de la Parra, in his book, is unequivocal. He believes Alan chose his final resting place carefully. He took his sleeping bag and went up on that quiet hill, surrounded by the nature he loved, and simply went to sleep for the last time. He finally went up the country, to a place where he hoped he could find peace. There was no note, but for those who knew him, his entire life had been a kind of suicide note, a long, quiet plea for an escape he could only find in death. His death was the first in a shocking trilogy that would define the end of an era. Just 2 weeks later, on September 18th, Jimi Hendrix died in London. A month after that, on October 4th, Janis Joplin died in a Hollywood hotel. Morrison would follow the next year. The deaths of these three titans created a media firestorm and cemented the myth of the 27 Club. But somehow, Alan Wilson's death, the first of the sequence, was largely overlooked. Why? Why has the man who sang the anthem of Woodstock been so thoroughly forgotten, while his contemporaries were immortalized? There are a few reasons. Part of it was his image, or lack thereof. Hendrix was a guitar god, a psychedelic revolutionary. Joplin was a force of nature, a raw, blues-shouting mama. Morrison was the Lizard King, a leather-clad poet of darkness and sex. They were all beautiful, charismatic, and photogenic. Alan Wilson was none of those things. He was short, owlish, and uncomfortable in his own skin. He was the anti-rock star. He mumbled, he looked at his shoes, he hid behind his hair and his glasses. His genius was subtle, academic. It didn't translate to a poster on a teenager's wall. The band itself, Canned Heat, also played a role. While they were hugely successful, they were seen as blues purists, a boogie band, rather than revolutionary artists on the same level as Hendrix or The Doors. After Alan's death, they carried on with new lineups and new music, which perhaps diluted the tragic mystique of their original incarnation. They became a working band, not a legend frozen in time. The consequence of this forgetting is that a crucial piece of the 1960s story is missing. Alan Wilson wasn't just a footnote. He was a foundational architect of the sound of that era. He was a bridge between the ancient past of the Delta blues and the psychedelic future of rock. His work with Son House was a profound act of cultural preservation. His musicianship, that hypnotic droning guitar and that soulful harmonica, gave Canned Heat its unique sonic signature, and his environmentalism was astonishingly ahead of its time. Years before the first Earth Day, he was writing and singing about ecological disaster. One of his last songs, Poor Moon, is a heartbreaking lament about humanity's impending destruction of the moon. He sings, "Woke up this morning with a tear in my eye. I saw the men on the moon and I heard the poor moon cry. Oh, the human race is dying out and I'm as sad to see it go. I know the sun's going to miss us. I know the moon will too." This wasn't a political statement for him. It was a deep personal grief. He felt the wounds we were inflicting on the planet as if they were his own. He was a gentle soul in a brutal world, and he simply couldn't bear the weight of it all. So what is the legacy of the Blind Owl? It's not in a gallery of famous rock and roll portraits. It's in the music. It's in that moment at Woodstock when the sun is setting, and a high, haunting voice floats over the crowd, offering a vision of a better place. It's in the hypnotic drone of "On the Road Again," a sound that still evokes the feeling of a long, dark highway and the endless search for something more. His story is a profound and cautionary tale. It's about the collision of pure artistry and the crushing machinery of fame. It's a reminder that the people who create our most joyous anthems are often fighting the darkest battles. Alan Wilson gave a voice to a generation's dream of escape, but he was the one who needed to escape the most. He was a scholar who became a star, a conservationist who became a casualty, a gentleman who made powerful stomping music. He remains a paradox, the man who taught a legend how to remember his own songs, but who has been largely forgotten himself. The man who sang of jumping in the water and staying drunk all the time, but whose private life was one of sober, academic contemplation and quiet despair. Perhaps the most fitting way to remember Alan Wilson is to see him as he likely saw himself, a temporary custodian of an ancient sound. He didn't invent the blues, but he loved it so purely that he was able to channel its spirit and translate it for a world that desperately needed to hear it. He was a vessel, and the music flowed through him, but the vessel was fragile, and eventually it broke. He wasn't a rock god. He was just a man, a brilliant, troubled, gentle man with thick glasses and a heart that was too big and too sensitive for this world. And he deserves to be remembered. And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. Appreciate you watching.